hang on, folks. We'll be starting shortly. The presenter is logging in. We just got to get him connected to the audio, but we'll be up and running in a minute or so here. Still waiting for our presenter to dial in. He's working on it. He's hang on with us. We'll be right there. you, Corey?
Hello?
Corey?
Hey, yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, hey, John, I know you want to start the recording. You can go ahead.
All right, just give me a second to put some earphones in. Okay, can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, cool. So I'm ready when you are.
Okay, I'm just waiting for our recording to start.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry for the delay, everybody. Thank you for patiently waiting for us. I appreciate that. So, to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled Agile, Energy Efficient, and Trustworthy Intelligence at the Edge. My name is Steve Warzala. I'm CSIAC Outreach Manager. Administrative notes before we begin. Phones have been muted except for presenters. Questions will be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function, and time permitting, at the end of the session. Today's briefing slides will be posted on our website within a few days. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. Funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. It's my pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar. That's Dr. Merkel. Dr. Merkel is an assistant professor with the Department of Computer Engineering at the Rochester Institute of Technology. From 2016 to 2018, Corey was a research electronics engineer with the Information Directorate, part of the Air Force Research Laboratory. His current research focuses on mapping of AI algorithms, primarily artificial neural networks, to mixed signal hardware and design of brain-inspired computing systems using emerging technologies and trustworthy AI hardware. Dr. Merkel's research has been published in a number of peer-reviewed conferences, journals, and books. He earned his BS and MS degrees in computer engineering and a PhD in microsystems engineering, all from RIT. We'll now turn the presentation over to Dr. Merkel. Good afternoon, Corey. The floor is now yours.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Steve Warzala and John Reed and Joe Caroli for inviting me to give this webinar. So the first webinar I've ever done. This is kind of exciting. So what I want to talk about today is some of the research I've been doing really since I started my PhD back at RIT in the early 2010s. Then that continued through my time at the Air Force Research Lab and now as a faculty member at RIT. So after a brief introduction, we'll take a look at some of the different research areas that our group focuses on most heavily. And so those are essentially circuits for artificial neural networks, random artificial neural network topologies, and then stochastic information representation techniques in artificial neural networks. So it should be, I think, maybe no surprise to this group that the big data landscape is continually growing. So AI is a really hot area right now, and there are a number of companies and government agencies and universities that are heavily investing in AI, either as a means to enhance their products or for curiosity reasons, right, to basically get at why humans learn the way they do, or to further some of the technological advancements that are required, to keep our country safe and to ensure that we have the best technical edge in that arena. So up until maybe about 2012, we had this sort of interesting dilemma where a number of deep learning algorithms existed, but they couldn't really handle the amount of data that we're throwing at them. And really, AI took off in 2012 when we were able to, for the first time, demonstrate very efficient methods of learning with the vast amount of data that was available. And from then on, we've seen this sort of continual advancement in the numbers of algorithms, in data set collection, and in a number of other dimensions of AI. But even given that, the human brain, as it turns out, still vastly outperforms AI, even in very simple tasks like image classification. And the reason for this, I think, is largely due to the stark contrast we see between digital computers and the types of computational paradigms that we see in the brain. So things like how signals are transmitted across the system, the precision that we see in those two different platforms, parallelism, and so on, are very different in computers and biological brains. And really what that has led to is a huge difference in terms of size, weight, and power consumption between those two platforms. And so as a result, what we have is that current artificial intelligence lacks a few things that we would like it to have. First of all, it lacks agility. So applications where size and weight limits really dictate the type of technology we can have on board really aren't accessible by current AI. Current AI also lacks energy efficiency. So power consumption is actually too large for either battery-operated or energy harvesting platforms that are out in the field. And so one example is that we can think of as military Internet of Things, right? So we might have a number of sensors out in the field that each have vastly different types of data coming in and need to sort of make sense of that data before it communicates it to a network. And with current AI techniques, pushing that intelligence from the network right onto the sensors is very challenging because of essentially the power requirements and the computational requirements that are required by essentially deep learning today. So what our group does is we sort of rethink AI at all layers of the stack. So our idea is we want to move really from algorithm-driven hardware to hardware-driven algorithms. And we want to think about the brain as sort of a guiding example of how we can achieve truly energy efficient and agile AI, and this is really a multi-disciplinary effort. So our lab's mission statement is basically are interested in advancing the field of artificial intelligence by exploring the interplay between a number of different domains that we collaborate with, which includes neuroscience, machine learning, and experts in novel hardware. So let's move on and start to talk about some of the specific subdomains of our research group. So we're using the human brain as sort of a guiding example, and there's still a large amount about how the brain performs computations that isn't known. But for the better part of the last century, a lot of work was done on at least getting some sense of the computational motifs that are used in biological nervous systems. And so what we do know about the brain is that it uses networks of information convergence or information integrators called neurons, and these basically sum information from other parts of the network and then apply some nonlinear computation to it. We know that those neurons are connected to each other through weighted synapses. So synapses in biology communicate to other neurons using neurotransmitters. And so we can model synapses as basically weighted communication pathways throughout our network. We also know that the way that biological systems learn is at least partially achieved by modification of those weighted communication pathways, so modification of those synaptic weights. And finally, we know that the way that the neurons are connected to each other, so the topology or the structure of the network, largely informs the behavior of the network. And we see a lot of different types of neurons, types of topologies, and types of synapses in the human brain. So we should be open to also replicating that diversity in artificial systems. So one of the types of technologies that we've been very interested in for implementing artificial neural networks in hardware is something called a Memristor. So for our purposes here, we can think of a Memristor as basically just a variable resistor. So we can set its resistance to a value, and when we take the power away from the circuit, that resistance value will be maintained. So it's a non-volatile type of memory element. And the nice thing about it is it really facilitates the three main things that biological synapses facilitate, which are computation, memory, and learning. So we know that resistors, for example, can perform computation just through Ohm's law. So the voltage is equal to the current times the resistance. So we have a multiplication that can be performed by this simple device. Since the resistance value that's stored in the Memristor is non-volatile, we can also use Memristors as memory elements. And since we can actually modify the resistance of the Memristors, we can use those devices to facilitate incremental learning. So our group has looked at a few different circuits where we integrate Memristors into artificial neural network hardware as a means of performing synaptic connections between neurons. And so this is just one example where we've taken sort of a common cortical microcircuit that has a presynaptic neuron, a postsynaptic neuron, and then a couple of synapses in between them. And we've developed some hardware that replicates that functionality by integrating Memristors with what's essentially called a current mirror. And so these are the CMOS or conventional IC technology types of devices. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. Okay. So these CMOS devices form current mirrors, and these Memristor devices basically store the synaptic weight that allows a synaptic neuron to either attenuate a postsynaptic neuron or amplify the response of a postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so that's just one example of how we can use these types of devices to design very compact hardware for synaptic communication in artificial neural networks. We can also take these Memristor devices, and because they have such a simple structure, they only have 2 terminals, we can integrate them into very high density crossbars, where essentially we have some number of, we'll say n squared devices, so n squared Memristors, or we can think of them as synapses really, that can be addressed by just 2 times n different ports. So we're looking at columns basically on this crossbar, right, and rows crossbar. And so these columns plus these rows we can think of as the ways that we address all the different Memristors in this structure. And this is a very compact way to address a lot of different devices using very little interface circuitry. So we've designed a number of different methods specifically for how we do this. Some are based on voltage mode techniques, some are based on current mode techniques, and the main point here is that regardless of whether or not we're using voltage or current mode, or regardless of the exact details, we basically have a nice, simple, compact circuit that's really representing all of the memories and all of the sort of communication pathways between 2 entire layers of neurons in our artificial neural network. So we can build this up even further, and we can think about taking these Memristor devices and these Memristor crossbar circuits and integrating them into very energy efficient neural cores, which can then communicate with each other over a network on chip. And so I'm showing one example here of a design that we developed a few years ago, where we have, again, one of these Memristor crossbars that is storing synaptic weights. And then we have some interface circuitry that can perform different neuron level computations, whether it's nonlinear activation functions or doing other sorts of post-processing to get that signal ready to send to the rest of our network. So if you think about how something like this, how this type of Memristor crossbar-based circuit would compare to a state-of-the-art CPU, at least for neural network types of computations, we see, especially on the bottom table here, that the Memristor-based implementations can actually give us hundreds of thousands improvement in power efficiency over something like a CPU. So here we're saying we're comparing to what's called a RISC processor. So that's a reduced instruction set computer. And we see, again, that we have close to 200,000x improvement in power efficiency because we're integrating these very low power Memristor devices into our circuit. Okay, so in terms of applications of this type of research, we've thought about one thing that we've thought about is how we can design an art for simultaneous localization and mapping. So this is
with what Michael?
Yes. Was there a question?
No, I think you can proceed.
Okay. So simultaneous localization and mapping, we can think about this sort of scenario where we have maybe a drone or some other robot that's in sort of an unfamiliar location, is trying to find some target, and maybe it doesn't have GPS connectivity, so it has to simultaneously locate something, and to do so it has to sort of map its environment as it moves throughout it. And so we've been looking at the idea that we could use a different flavor of these Memristor devices. In this case, we're considering what are called gated Memristors. So instead of just having 2 terminals, they actually have 3 terminals. And we can basically use those to implement this or to integrate into a SLAM architecture and get very efficient localization and mapping. And this third terminal essentially allows us to do a few things over the 2 terminal devices. So first of all, it allows us to simultaneously read and write to the device. It reduces something that we call sneak paths, which is basically something that leads to sort of increased power consumption. Sneak paths can also lead to basically erroneous reading of the Memristor state, and so it also helps us improve upon that. And the other nice thing is that it helps us reduce write voltage and power consumption. So we've developed not just synapses for this SLAM architecture, but we need neurons to go along with them. And so we've designed some spiking neurons. So these are basically neurons that behave very similar to the biological neurons that we see in our own nervous system. So this is the circuit design. It's a fairly basic design that uses some feedback in order to generate a spike. And you can see the behavior of it in this plot here, where over time, as we put some current into the input of the circuit, eventually it integrates up to a point and reaches a threshold and then produces a spike. So you'd see something very similar to this coming out of the neurons in your brain, for example. And we've done some other characterizations, like how frequency can increase as we basically apply more current into the input of the neuron. So putting these 2 things together, the synapse designs and the neuron designs, we've developed sort of a preliminary architecture for simultaneous localization and mapping. And I won't go through all the details here, but we've essentially found that we can very efficiently, at least in a constrained environment, in a lower dimensional environment, so in this case just 2 dimensions, we can perform basically landmark finding through learning and with very low power. So I think this slide gives a nice example. So the task for our robot was essentially to find a blue target in our environment. So it started at the green, and the first part of the algorithm, basically the robot is just exploring the environment. So it comes across red, another red, and orange, and then it finally finds the blue target. And along the way, it's making associations between its location and the types of landmarks it's seeing. And then in the second trial, it learned to go directly from the green starting point to the blue target because of those associations that it's made. So this work is in collaboration with a faculty member at the University of Cincinnati, and we're trying to apply for some funding right now to actually get this to the next step, which is fabricating a chip that can sort of give us a proof of concept of this architecture. So moving on now from what's happening at the circuit level to the architecture level. So all of our circuits we can integrate into larger designs very efficiently by thinking about what are called random neural network topologies. So we know that state-of-the-art deep learning algorithms aren't typically random. So all the parameters in those networks are trained through something like backpropagation, which is basically a gradient descent type of algorithm. However, in hardware, we get different types of randomness, so different types of stochastic behavior for free from a lot of different underlying mechanisms. And so if we can think about how we can use that random behavior in a useful way, that we can get very, very efficient implementations of AI. And so the idea is that we have artificial neural network topologies now with some sort of fixed and random synaptic weights. And as I said, we can really leverage the natural stochastic behavior of devices like Memristors. And if we're only learning now a subset of the parameters in our network and leaving some of them as just fixed random values, we're also going to get a very largely running cost. So I've drawn just one example of what a general random neural network topology might look like here. So this is essentially a network where the output weights, so the weights between the neurons in the output and the layer before the output, those are trained. So we have to do some training in order to get the network to perform the tasks that we want it to. But all of the other synaptic weights, whether they're feed forward in this case or they're feedback, so recurrent, those can be fixed and random, or some subset of those can be fixed and random. So there's a few different flavors of how this might look like in particular, and we've looked at basically each case. So in the case where we only have feed-forward random weights, this is actually an idea that was proposed a while back by Huang and his coworkers. And the type of network, so this type of network is called an extreme learning machine. And the idea is that we take some data, we cast it randomly into a high-dimensional space using these random weights, and then we learn the features, the random features in that space by performing some simple linear regression analysis. And so we've built different hardware architectures that can do this very efficiently and tested it on a number of data sets, including the handwritten digit classification data set, MNIST. So in the case where we actually have not just feed-forward weights, but we have some feedback in our network, we generally classify these types of neural networks as reservoir computing. And this is basically, we can think of a recurrent version of the network that we just looked at. So the idea is still the same. We're going to take our input data and we're going to cast it into this high-dimensional random feature space. But now we have feedback, and what that feedback affords us is some sort of temporal memory. So now instead of just looking at sort of static types of data sets, so data sets that don't have any temporal data, we can actually start to look at time series data. And so we've built reservoir computing architectures in our lab that can do things like detect epileptic seizures. We've also used reservoir computing for identifying individuals based on how they walk, so gait classification. And we've looked at a few other sort of temporal types of problems using this technique. So to me, I think the most surprising thing is that we can actually use this idea of random weights even with the most state-of-the-art types of neural networks. And these are the deep learning neural networks that are being used in all of the image classification types of work that a lot of universities and a lot of companies are pursuing. And so the idea here was we're interested in, if we took one of these deep learning convolutional networks, which have all of these sort of 2D spatial filters, and we replace those filters with just random weights, we're wondering what type of response we would get from the network. And so what we found was pretty interesting. So in this image here, what I'm showing is the type of image that would maximally give a maximal response, essentially, from different random filters. Okay, so in some cases, we see that random filters are maximally responsive to random images. So that's kind of what we expected to see throughout. But in other cases, we see that even random filters are maximally responsive to very regular types of features in the image, like different sort of grading patterns, different kinds of edge patterns in different orientations, and different types of patterns that maybe select interior parts of the image more or less than external parts of the image. And so what we did is we took this idea and we trained a neural network, a convolutional neural network, on synthetic aperture radar data. And what we found was that we can achieve state-of-the-art classification accuracy, so close to 100% test accuracy using a convolutional neural network with almost entirely random filters. So just a little bit of training on the output layer was all that was needed. And so I think this was a really surprising result, and I think it highlighted that a lot of the deep learning neural networks that we see today are incredibly over-parameterized, and there's a nice opportunity to reduce the size of the networks and to make them more compact, especially for embedded applications. So we've also done some statistical modeling of these random neural networks. This is a bit math heavy, so I won't go through all the details, but we basically have found that if we have much less data than the size of our model, which might be the case when we have data sets that are basically hard to collect or hard to label, or might be in some kind of a restricted domain, then we get sort of very interesting behavior as the size of that data set sort of approaches the size of our model. And in fact, if we have a number of training data that is equal to the size of our model, then we found that we actually have maximized the amount by which our model can overfit to the data. So it's sort of in summary of that, why that's important is we need to be aware of size of our model in order to select a data set size that sort of either avoids this area, or we need to get sort of data augmentation, have some kind of data augmentation technique that allows us to basically improve or reduce the amount of overfitting that our network is doing. So these are some mathematical details. I think in the interest of time, I'll take questions offline if there's any interest, but for now I'm just going to skip over them. So the next step of this modeling is, and to back up a minute actually, really the goal of this is, so we have networks that are performing well using completely random weights. And so, I mean, curiosity forces us to ask why is that happening, but also if we have some system deployed in mission critical applications, right, there's going to be there's going to be some reluctance to rely on randomness, right, to produce outputs of these networks. So we need to know, we need to have a better theoretical foundation and have a better idea of how and why and in what cases these types of networks are going to fail. So next steps related to this specific project are to basically look at, look at a few different things, but most importantly, one thing we want to know is if we can optimize really the size of our networks when we have random weights using some sort of theoretical foundation as a guiding principle. So again, I can take more questions about that offline if anyone's interested. So I want to move on now to something that's really interesting, which is the idea that we can actually get really efficient computation in artificial neural networks by leveraging a different way of really representing the data in our networks. And typically the way we represent data, at least in a digital system, is with these sort of place-dependent binary representations. So the idea with a stochastic representation is to basically throw that out and just represent values probabilistically. Okay, so I have an example that I've written here. If we wanted to represent the fraction sense, the way we would represent this stochastically is we would have a what I call a stream of bits. So this is basically a sequence of bits. And the probability that any one of these bits is set to 1 would be 3 out of 7. So that's how we would represent that information. And we can also represent, for example, negative numbers using this technique by modifying it a little bit. So once we have that kind of representation in our system, some really interesting things happen. Namely, we can perform computations on the data very efficiently by using what's called stochastic logic. So we can perform things like multiplication, which would normally take several adder circuits and AND gates. In this case, using just a single AND gate. So for any arbitrary, we'll say bit width or precision of our two operands, Z1 or Z2, we can get the multiplication of those two values using just a single AND gate. And so that's really a huge, huge savings. And we can do other things like negate values or evaluate different polynomials, lots of other things, just by using very simple digital logic circuits with information that's encoded probabilistically. So one of the places we have been thinking about using this is in the training algorithm that's used to basically get neural networks to learn some particular task. And so these neural networks are usually trained by using some flavor of what's called gradient descent learning. And so some of you might know this as backpropagation. And the idea is that we look at how the cost or how basically how well our network is doing. And so we call that the cost function. We look at the cost function and how it changes as we change different parameters in the network. And then we use that to inform how we should change the parameters in the network incrementally. And when you actually implement this in practice, the amount by which you have to change a parameter, in this case it's one of our synaptic weights, becomes really a product of several different partial derivatives of our cost function. So in other words, we have several multiplications that have to take place. And so that can be expensive, right? In digital hardware, I just said it requires several adders and AND gates. In analog hardware, it requires analog multipliers. So in both cases, that can be very expensive. So we've tried to think about how we can actually reduce the cost of this computation using this idea of stochastic logic. And we've found, for example, that in one type of gradient descent algorithm, which is related to something called the perceptron learning rule, where we basically are looking at the error between our network output and our expected output, as well as the input to the network. So we have to perform a multiplication between those two things. And to do that, we replace the analog multiplier with just a stochastic, an AND gate basically that performs multiplication using stochastic representations. And so what we found was that in the case of the stochastic implementation, we get about at least 3.5 times area reduction over the analog implementation. And the good news is that both implementations give us identical results when we implement them into a neural network that learns something like the MNIST digit classification data set. So we took this idea even further and we thought about how we can actually not just implement the training part of our neural network, but the entire network, so synapses and neurons as well, using stochastic logic. And so this is one example of a network, neural network that we designed that is a recurrent neural network. So this is one of those reservoir computing algorithms that we designed. And the entire thing you can see, with the exception of maybe a couple of interface nodes, is just simple digital logic circuits. So we have some XNOR gates, we have some multiplexers, and we have some flip-flops. And the interesting thing that we found is that for classification problems, so where we're trying to determine if an input belongs to, say, class A or class B, we can actually outperform the deterministic design of this. So that's the design where we're not using stochastic logic. And the reason is that the stochastic representation that we're using sort of inherently adds noise to our algorithm, and that noise turns out to become a useful tool for making sure that we don't overfit our training data. So for example, what I'm showing here is we have two lines that say L equal infinity. So those are the performance of the deterministic algorithm. And you see that if we make our stochastic representation large enough, we are actually able to outperform those deterministic designs. So we've also looked at how we can actually implement this on something like an FPGA. So this would be something that could be out in the field for immediate or near-term kind of use. We found that in terms of area on the FPGA, so how much of the board we took up essentially, if we can perform the binary to stochastic number conversion efficiently, then we would be able to get a huge savings in the amount of real estate on the FPGA. But currently, the way we're currently doing it basically tells us that we're going to have about the same amount of area taken up, about the same amount of area as we did in the deterministic design. So we're currently looking at essentially ways to improve this binary to stochastic conversion using different noise sources. So some future work that our group is interested in, and I'd be happy to talk about any more of this offline or when we get to questions. So we're always looking for more biological inspiration. One of the things that we're currently working on that I didn't have a slide for is how we can actually look at how the brain optimizes its energy usage and how we can try to emulate that in hardware and essentially have AI hardware that not only learns a specific task, but learns how to do it in an energy efficient way. We've also recently been very interested in what's called adversarial machine learning. So adversarial machine learning is a really hot topic these days, and it's essentially related to the idea that current state-of-the-art deep learning algorithms are brittle in the sense that small modifications of inputs to those types of algorithms can be used to fool the algorithm in a malicious way. And so our group is interested in how that translates to the context of hardware. So when we have AI implemented in hardware, what are the unique hardware characteristics that are either going to help to mitigate the possibility of some of those attacks, or what are the characteristics of hardware that might make those systems more susceptible to those kinds of attacks? Finally, there's a number of application spaces that our group is interested in. My main interest, which I guess is sort of motivated by my time at Air Force Research Lab, is really defense applications, so military, IoT, remote sensing, and space situational awareness are some of the areas where we've been thinking about applying some of this technology. And so with that, I know we got a little bit of a late start, so I hope there's still some time for questions, but thank you very much for listening, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Corey. That's some cutting-edge, state-of-the-art work there, and we appreciate you appreciate your efforts in this area. So we do have a couple questions that we'll get to, and if anybody else is online and has any others, feel free to text them in there or chat in the chat area there. So one of the first questions, I think it was back with your area, the random neural net topologies, and the individual was curious as to what size array did you use for your proof of concept activity there?
So we've looked at a few different random neural network topologies. So I think if we're talking about the sort of feed-forward flavor, which we used for some image classification tasks, then I believe we looked at something like maybe 64-ish neurons in our hidden layer. And in some cases, we may have actually had 2 hidden layers of around 64 neurons. Now, having said that, one thing to know is that, right, nothing comes for free. So if we're not training our network and we're relying on random features to tell us something useful about our inputs, then of course the probability that we're going to get the right random features increases as we increase the size of our network. So typically we have to have a little bit larger networks when we're working with random projections. But the upside is, even though those networks are larger, the implementation might still be smaller because the circuitry that's required, or not required rather, to train those weights gives us a huge savings.
Okay, great. Thanks for fielding that question. We have another one dealing with the reservoir computing, and the question is, how do you get the digital result, and is there an A to D step in the I/O process?
Sure. So I think that's probably a question about the stochastic implementation of the reservoir computing. And so yes, there has to be some. If we're working with real-world signals, then there has to be some sort of A to D conversion that would go from, let's say, audio coming in and then go through our binary to stochastic conversion process. And so the ATD can be costly, and so we're not claiming necessarily that we've removed that bottleneck, but if the implementation was already digital, then moving from a deterministic to a stochastic implementation does give us significant area savings.
Hey, great.
Yep.
I'm sorry, did you have something more to add?
No, I think that was it. So I think that was the first part of the question. Could you repeat the second part of the question?
Oh, well, it was how do you get the digital result in the reservoir computer? I think it said it was the how do you get the digital result with the reservoir computer, and is there an A to D step in the I/O? Those were that was the question.
Okay. Yeah. So in summary, yes, there's an analog to digital conversion in the I/O.
Okay. I think the gentleman was happy with the answer. You covered what he was looking to what he was looking for. So I'm kind of curious. What do you see in your work here? What do you think are some of the bigger challenges, that face in trying to move this research forward in this area?
Sure. So there's a couple. I think one of the main ones is how do we know when we've done a good job? Everyone wants to know when they've done a good job, right? So there's this big issue with with sort of benchmarking these kinds of systems. So there's a lot of universities and companies that are working on this kind of research, and each one sort of uses maybe a slightly different benchmark to compare their work with other work. Sometimes it's to show their work in the best light, and sometimes it's just because there aren't better benchmarks available. So something that our group is sort of interested in is sort of kind of a one-off side project that we're collaborating with some other folks on, is developing better benchmarks that don't just tell us, for example, how much, how power efficient our system is, or don't just tell us how accurate our system is, but tries to sort of incorporate everything that we want in these types of systems. So learning capability, expected performance on certain types of problems, energy efficiency, right? All of those sorts of things into either a single sort of quantifiable benchmark or set of benchmarks. And our approach has been to use some concepts from information theory that we are seeing being applied to some of the deep learning algorithms recently, actually. And they're being applied basically to sort of remove the black box, right, from the algorithm and get a better idea of what's going on inside. So benchmarking, I'd say, is probably the biggest challenge going forward.
Okay, thanks for elaborating on that. And so I've got one other thing I'll throw out at you, and I'm just wondering if there are any other specific characteristics of the brain, that might shed some light on how to improve artificial intelligence.
Sure. So in this talk, I highlighted things that are very well known from the neuroscience community. So we know that there's different types of networks in the brain, and they're composed of neurons and synapses. And so the work on artificial neural networks spans all the way back, to the 1940s and even before. But I think more recently we're seeing some very fundamental differences between artificial neural networks and the way or the paradigm that's used in biology to perform computation, which is becoming informative. So one difference is the amount of recurrency that we see in biology. The state-of-the-art deep neural networks are mostly feed-forward, so they don't really have a lot of feedback from, we'll say, more abstract information representations back down to more, we'll say, raw information representations. But in the brain, we see a lot of that. And one of our group's hypotheses is that that's actually something that, if we add to artificial neural networks, could help substantially in reducing the susceptibility of these algorithms to different types of adversarial attacks. So the second thing that I'll mention is the sort of whole other type of cell that we see in neural networks, which are neuroglia. So these actually outnumber neurons in our brain, but we don't typically see them incorporated into artificial neural networks, because I think until recently it was thought that they were just sort of a support structure for neurons. But some of the new research suggests that they actually perform very important computational roles. They help to regulate energy in the network. And so I think taking a closer look at the functions those are performing in a biological setting and thinking about how we can maybe emulate some of that in artificial systems is really important going forward.
So I'm not 100% sure of this, but I thought I recall that they had actually dissected Einstein's brain, and when they did the analysis on it, I think they found that he had a much higher percentage of glial cells than like the average person. So there could be something, there could be something, there to those, trying to add that into your, into your research. That could be an interesting area for exploration.
Yeah. So I've heard that as well. I think there's just a whole lot about the brain that's still unknown, and there's a lot of exciting research coming out, every day. And so I think just being vigilant and keeping an eye on what the neuroscience community is doing, and trying to use that information to improve our systems, our artificial systems. I think that's basically the key.
Okay. Well, Dr. Merkel, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to share your research with us. Like I said, very, very interesting work you're doing, and I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today. And if you have any last words, you can.
Sure. So I want to thank Steve and John and Joe Caroli for inviting me to give this talk. Apologize we got off to a little bit of a rough start, but hopefully I provided some useful information to everyone out there in webinar land, and I hope everyone's in light of recent events staying safe and healthy, and feel free to follow up on any points that you think are interesting. You can certainly send my email online, and I'd be happy to talk about anything else that you might be interested in.
Okay, that's great. So, folks, like you said, Corey said, if you have questions for him, he's happy to take your questions. And once again, thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.